This is the Mareeba Pioneer Cemetery. There are over 1,600 marked and unmarked graves here from the late 19th century to 1965. There are over 150 infants buried here who died prior to the end of World War II in 1945. There are a further 50 children buried here from the same time period. Families in mourning, losing their children before their time. But what were the causes of this heartache, and why did it change? Who were the leaders of Australia's overhaul on infant mortality? At the turn of the 19th century, child mortality rates within Australia were unbelievably high. But why was this? Following World War II, there was a dramatic and almost instant drop in child mortality rates. What were the childhood death rates in the late 19th and early 20th century in Australia? Death at birth or shortly after was a common phenomenon at the turn of the 19th century, with mortality rates in 1912 of 80 deaths for males and 63 for females when less than 1 year of age for every 1,000 live births. By the year 2000, that number had dropped to 6 and 5 deaths respectively. Death in early childhood, including infancy, began at rates higher than 2,000 deaths per 100,000 population and accounted for 25% of all deaths in Australia in 1907. This fell to 100 deaths per 100,000 population, resulting in a percentage drop of 1.2% in the year 2000. Children aged 5 to 14 had a mortality rate much lower, at 359 per 100,000 populace in 1907. Signifying that surviving early childhood in Australia was the most challenging stage of life. This rate dropped to just 25 per 100,000 populace in the year 2000. What were the leading causes of death at the turn of the 19th century? At the start of the 20th century, the mortality rate for children aged 0 to 4 accounted for 25% of all deaths in Australia. The causes of this high rate were infectious diseases, which in today's society are rarely seen. They included tuberculosis, polio, smallpox, hepatitis, measles, and diarrhea. Other impacts to a lesser and seasonal effect were pneumonia, bronchitis, and the flu. Economic impacts were to a lesser extent still contributing, with the most prominent events being the Great War and the Great Depression. In 1907, the 10 leading causes of death were organic heart disease, tuberculosis, diarrhea, senility, congenital, bronchitis, pneumonia, nephritis, cerebrovascular disease, unspecified and ill-defined. Of all these causes, there was one that attributed to the deaths of the majority of infants in early Australia. Diarrhea is categorized as excessive and watery evacuation of the bowel's contents, which when severe and left untreated can lead to a marked loss of body fluids and even death. It can be caused by a range of intestinal infections and other forms of bowel inflammation, and proved to be fatal to thousands of children in early Australia. Although diarrhea now rarely causes death in developed countries like Australia, it is presented here because it was the third leading cause of death for both male and female infants early in the century. It especially affected children aged 0 to 4, accounting for around a quarter of all infant deaths in early Australia. Viruses and parasites developed, so did the need for sanitary conditions, good health, and the effects of dehydration and rehydration. The death rates for diarrhea for 0 to 4-year-olds reduced dramatically over the last century. Rates fell from around 700 per 100,000 for males and 580 for females at the beginning of the century to under 100 for both sexes by 1935, then to around 2 or less deaths per 100,000 by the mid 1980s, and finally to around 2 deaths per million by the year 2000. Congenital conditions were, in the early 1900s, any condition which originated in the perinatal period and those of a congenital origin. The perinatal period generally occurred after birth and included conditions related to gestational length, fetal growth, trauma during birth, respiratory and cardiovascular disorders confined to this period. Congenital conditions were those recognized or present at birth and were considered the significant source of chronic disease and disability. They led to death within the first year of life, with some conditions leading to a later death. Another condition was heart defects, which in the early 20th century was fatal, but is now correctable with surgery. Fall throughout the 20th century in death rates for conditions in the perinatal period, going from 1,450 deaths in the 0 to 4 age group to just 100 in the year 2000. The death rate in regards to congenital conditions, however, is not as straightforward. Starting at 170 per 100,000 populace in the early 1900s, it rose to 233 during the early 1940s. At the conclusion of World War II, however, this rate dropped as dramatically as it rose, and in the year 2000 was down to 55. The 1800s and early 1900s were plagued with child mortality. Those children lucky enough to survive birth then struggled through early childhood with diarrhea. But that wasn't all they had to overcome. Infectious epidemics were common until the 1930s, with serious consequences for small children, particularly in regards to the measles, scarlet fever, smallpox, and the Spanish flu. There were 5 serious measles outbreaks in 1867, 1875, 1893, 1898, and 1920. The 1867 epidemic was the biggest, with estimates that in Sydney alone, over 80% of those infected were children. Scarlet fever also struck down thousands in the 1870s, with over 8,000 deaths, 46% of which were children. Smallpox epidemics were also frequent, with the most serious epidemics in 1881 to 82 and 1913 to 1917. The mortality rate was not as high as measles, but did leave thousands scarred and permanently impaired. 2 other epidemics with few deaths but high infectious rates were the Asiatic flu in 1890 and the plague in 1900, the latter of which was restricted mostly to Sydney, New South Wales. The Spanish flu was the most deadly epidemic in world history. It entered Australia in 1918 through Victoria and quickly spread throughout the country. The flu was not discriminatory, affecting 1 million people countrywide, with only a 5 million population at the time. Some 10,000 people died, the majority of which were young children and the elderly. Worldwide, the Spanish flu estimated to have killed nearly 50 million people during its 1-year course. This fatality rate is more than the Great War and any epidemic in recorded history. The economic impacts on child mortality are mostly limited to the Great War and the Great Depression. The Great War saw families separated, fathers and brothers fighting in the war, many to never return. Mothers stayed at home caring for children and trying to get whatever work they could. Many families were reduced to poverty conditions, on rations due to food shortages, which was influenced by a lack of able workers, as they were all off fighting the war overseas. No sooner were families reconciled following the war then a bigger threat entered the country. In 1932, Australia, with the rest of the world, suffered the Great Depression. Unemployment rate jumped to 32%. Husbands and sons left their families in search of work anywhere they could find it. Children left school at the age of 12, helping support their families with their mothers by becoming housemaids, labourers, cleaners, and whatever they could get their hands on. During this time, a ration of a cup of soup was given to school-aged children to ensure they were getting some nutrition. Families who could not afford to retain their residences were evicted and forced to live either in the streets or in unemployment camps where conditions were unhealthy, squalid, and rations were scarce. Whilst the birth rate dropped significantly during this time, the death rate remained the same. Livingstone was Australia's first Commonwealth Director-General of Health and has been heralded by some as the father of public health in Australia. After studying abroad in the early 1900s, he returned to Australia and began to implement changes in public health. These changes included improved sanitation, fresh water, and better living conditions. Early bacterial research began, and the improvements in disease identification led to isolation controls and in turn paved the way to mass vaccinations in the 1950s. Physiology and biochemistry were also included, allowing preventable diseases to be discovered and treated. The first phase began in 1901 and ended in 1918. Compston focused on infectious disease prevention and control in individuals, particularly that of mothers and children. He was convinced that unemployment and poor housing were undermining health, and that breastfeeding infants was the most important protection against gastro. His slogan was, "There is no feeding equal to breastfeeding," and trained health workers to visit new mothers each day to encourage this action. To the 1930s, in which a Commonwealth Department of Health promoted a national public health service focusing on child and maternal health and welfare. During this time, nutrition and physical fitness were of a major concern due to the malnutrition and health deterioration of Indigenous Australians. Compston also attempted to bring about a national health insurance. This was not successful at the time, but this idea was the foundation for what would soon become Medibank in 1975. Reforms from Compston lasted from 1930 to the 1945. Compston focused on the creation of a national health service which was state-financed and accessible to all. It used both preventative and curative medicine, but did not replace private doctors. During this time, baby health centres were established to train mothers in the care of children and likewise monitor child nutrition and growth. This was the beginnings of child health nurses as they are known today. Mortality can be contributed to many factors and people over the last 68 years. The introduction of baby health centres with trained nurses at the beginning of the 20th century focused on keeping infants healthy and was aimed at reducing infectious diseases and improved both the nutritional and physical health of the child. This was the forerunner for the current child and family health services. The effectiveness of maternal health centres in the early 1940s addressed the issues of infant mortality by ensuring the health and well-being of the mother and child both pre- and post-birth. The identification of diseases and the need to quarantine persons with communicable diseases and illnesses helped limit the spread and infection to others. The improvement in living conditions, most particularly sanitation and waste management, aided in the prevention of illnesses such as gastroenteritis and diarrhea. The workings of Compston and his passion for improving the health of Australians paved the way for scientists, researchers, doctors, nurses, and generations of healthy children to come. The introduction of research into infectious diseases in the early 1900s paved the way for the biological research in the years that have followed. The introduction of immunization clinics has also aided in the prevention of known diseases and illnesses by way of vaccination. Vaccinations in Australia started with smallpox in 1917 and continued over the years with the following: 1917 tetanus, 1925 pertussis, also known as whooping cough, 1927 diphtheria, 1932 there was community immunisation clinics for the public, in 1945 tetanus for all persons, 1953 diphtheria, tetanus and pertussis combination, 1956 polio, 1969 measles, 1971 rubella, 1981 mumps, 1983 measles and mumps as combined, 1983 hepatitis B, 1989 measles, mumps and rubella combined vaccine, 1992 Hib, also known as Haemophilus influenzae, such as meningitis or septicemia, 1993 hepatitis A, 2002 meningococcal C, 2005 varicella, 2007 HPV, and most recently in 2007 rotavirus. This is not an exhaustive list and does not include the ceasing, improvement and combination of some vaccines. Sanitation and living conditions, and awareness of contagions and improved medical care for infants and mothers that have all aided in the reduction of child mortality since the conclusion of the Second World War. The introduction of antibiotics such as sulfonamide in the 1930s and penicillin in the 1940s, combined with mass vaccinations in the 1940s and 50s, have dramatically influenced the fall in childhood mortality rates. Health knowledge, vaccine and antibiotic introductions have continued to improve over the rest of the century, resulting now in the lowest childhood mortality in Australian history.